So in this video, we're gonna get away from the cerebral hemispheres and look deeper at the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is made of three paired gray matter structures. We have the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, and all three enclose and surround the third ventricle. So if we looked at a cross-section here of the brain, we would see our cerebral hemisphere here and our corpus callosum that connects the two cerebral hemispheres together. Now, in this region, just sort of central to that, all of this is part of the diencephalon. If you all remember, the diencephalon is what develops from the middle portion of the neural tube, and that actually turns into three major regions here. We have our thalamus, our hypothalamus, hypo meaning below, and then epithalamus, which means nearby. So thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus make up your diencephalon, but there's two halves of the diencephalon. So we're looking at the right side of the diencephalon. There would also be a left side, and the right and left surround and encase a fluid-filled space, which would be right in this region here, which is the third ventricle. If y'all remember, the third ventricle is the CSF-filled space that connects with the lateral ventricles by this little canal here called the interventricular foramen of Monroe. So the thalamus is the largest of the diencephalon, and it's this bilateral, kind of egg-shaped nuclei that forms the superior lateral walls of the third ventricle, makes up 80% of your diencephalon, and these bilateral nuclei can sometimes be connected by something called the interthalamic adhesion or intermediate mass. Now, this is missing in a lot of individuals. It's not clear if you're missing an interthalamic adhesion, like whether that causes any deficits, but this just serves as an additional route of communication between the two thalami. Now, it contains several different nuclei that are named for the locations, and the nuclei that are in the thalamus receive fibers from the cortex. Now, if you looked at the thalamus here, remember it's kind of deep within the brain here, and it's a major part of your diencephalon. You have the right and left thalamic hemispheres, and in the middle of that you'd actually find the third ventricle. And if you looked at the anatomy of each thalamic hemisphere, you'd see there's lots of different nuclei here. So you have like the lateral dorsal nucleus and the lateral posterior nucleus and the pulvinar nucleus. Now, now it turns out that we're not actually going to focus on the names of these nuclei specifically, but it's important to note these because they all have specific functions. Now we'll just talk about the function of the thalamus generally. So the main function of the thalamus is to act as a relay center of information that goes to your cortex. So think about the thalamus as being like the FedEx or UPS of information for your brain, because essentially it sorts, edits, and relays information to the cortex. So impulses from your hypothalamus that are involved with emotion and visceral function. It sends impulses to the cerebellum that are involved with directing motor cortices, and impulses for memory and sensory integration. Now overall it acts to mediate sensation as well as motor activities, and so because of those two we see that the thalamus plays a very key role in what's called cortical arousal. So if you're feeling groggy or tired, that's because your thalamus isn't sending as much information to the cortex. Now it also plays a role in learning and memory. So the hypothalamus is located just below the thalamus. It forms a cap over the brainstem, forms this inferior lateral wall of the third ventricle, and the hypothalamus is like the major homeostatic regulatory center of your body, and it contains lots of important functions. It also contains something called the mammillary bodies, which are visible on the inferior surface of the brain, and there are these anterior nuclei that act as olfactory relay centers. Now the infundibulum also attaches to the hypothalamus, and it's essentially the stalk that connects the hypothalamus to a major endocrine gland, which is called the pituitary gland, which secretes a lot of different hormones that regulate homeostasis. So if you look at the hypothalamus here, you see that's just inferior to the thalamus. So here's the hypothalamus. And if you zoomed in on this, you'd see that there's lots of different nuclei here, all involved with a variety of unique functions. And the hypothalamus connects to the pituitary gland here by the infundibulum, or stalk of the pituitary. Now, the pituitary gland itself sits within a bony cavity of the sphenoid bone called the sella turcica, and the hypothalamus is just superior to that. Now, in terms of functions, it's the main visceral control center that's vital for homeostasis support. So its chief homeostatic controls are involved with controlling most of your autonomic nervous system, things like blood pressure, rate and force of heartbeat, as well as digestive tract motility or movement, and pupil size. All this is regulated by your hypothalamus. And it's also involved with initiating the physical responses to emotions. It's because it's part of the limbic system. So it's going to perceive pleasure, fear, rage. It controls biological rhythms and also is involved with sex drive. So this also is a very important aspect of the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus also regulates body temperature by sweating or shivering, regulates hunger and satiety in response to blood nutrient levels, regulates water balance and thirst. So if you're feeling thirsty, that involves the hypothalamus. It controls your endocrine system because of the regulation of your pituitary gland. And it also regulates your sleep-wake rhythm because it has something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, that basically sets our biological clock. Now, the epithalamus is the most dorsal portion of the diencephalon, and it forms the roof of the third ventricle. Now, the epithalamus is fairly small in proportion to the diencephalon, but it contains the pineal gland, which secretes a hormone called melatonin that's also involved with regulating the sleep-wake cycle. So if you looked at the diencephalon once more, you'd find our thalamus here with an intrathalamic adhesion that could connect to the other side of the thalamus. We have our hypothalamus just below it and our epithalamus nearby. Now, in the epithalamus, you can see things like your pineal gland, which secretes the hormone melatonin that's also involved with sleep-wake cycles. So just to summarize the functions of these three portions of the diencephalon, remember the thalamus is the sensory relay center of your brain and motor relay of the center of the brain. So most sensory information goes through the thalamus before being sent to the cortices, like visual information has to go through the thalamus before it goes to the primary visual cortex. Same with auditory information, as well as body sensation, like somatosensory information has to go through the thalamus before going to the parietal lobe. Except all sensory information goes through the thalamus except for olfaction or smell. So olfaction goes straight to the mammillary bodies of your hypothalamus down here. Remember, the hypothalamus is involved with a lot of vital homeostatic functions like controlling hunger and satiety, blood pressure, heart rate and rhythm, things like body temperature, thirst, water balance. It controls a lot of the release of hormones by your pituitary gland. It also regulates rhythms like your biological clock. So it's believed to be involved with things like puberty as well as the sleep-wake cycle. Just like the pineal gland of the epithalamus, that releases melatonin that's also involved with your sleep-wake cycle.